Well, welcome back to another webinar for GPSA, and thanks very much for joining us on your Tuesday night. It's been a beautiful day. I hope it has been in your part of the country as well. Tonight we have a session with Carolyn Johnson presenting on the managing stress and the mental health of your GP registrar. Now, obviously, many of you very experienced, some of you not so experienced, will have come across this very early in your terms. We're in a term 2 of 2017 at this stage. There will be things that are already becoming apparent, and so this webinar is incredibly timely. I'd like to thank Carolyn for making herself available for tonight as well. As we do for each of our sessions, we'd like to welcome you all here tonight from around the country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which this meeting is taking place around the country, and pay respects to their elders, past and present, and their families. Now, for those of you that haven't attended a GPSA webinar before, I'll run you through a little bit of housekeeping. We've muted yourselves basically to manage background noise, and if you can imagine, we've had 100 people register tonight. Some will continue to sign on. But if you can imagine 100 people trying to talk all at once, that would be a little bit ridiculous. So consequently, Carolyn, who tells me she can talk underwater, will have the unfettered access to the microphone tonight, including myself to top and tail that. You can, however, ask any questions you would like throughout the session. In fact, we encourage you to do so because it makes for a much more interesting webinar. You can do that by typing in the chat box. I can see Simon W. has just said that his screen is frozen. Hopefully that has been corrected. So at the moment you should see a little flashing sign that shows you the chat box. You can simply put your cursor in the little message box there and type a question. We will attempt to get to all of your questions, but obviously there may be too many questions to get through. Never fear, if we don't actually get to answer your question, we will be putting together a frequently asked questions that goes out with the recording of this webinar afterwards. So you will absolutely have an opportunity to access that. As I say, we are recording this webinar. We will make that available on our YouTube channel along with plenty of the other webinars that we've run this and in previous years. So for those that did sign up tonight and couldn't make it in the end because of unforeseen circumstances, it all is not lost. Now, also, if you haven't been to a webinar before, down the bottom right, you will also notice that there is a little folder. In that folder, there are a range of links and resources that relate to tonight's webinar and also to GPSA resources. So please do have a look through that as we're going through the presentation, and we'll actually highlight some of the links that Carolyn suggests in the chat box as we go along. So without further ado, I'm actually going to pass over to Carolyn and let you get on with the content that you actually came to see. Rightio. Take it away, Carolyn.
Okay. So I hope people can hear me now. I was freezing a bit too, but I think I'm coming good okay now. So Glenn, if you can give me a thumbs up, I'll know that things are working. Good evening, everyone. My name's Caroline Johnson. I work for GP Training and I'm a GP in Surrey Hills here in Melbourne. And I have a particular interest in the wellbeing of registrars, particularly because I'm the Registrar Support and Progress Coordinator for EV, and I'd like to thank them for allowing me to share this webinar with you tonight. Just clicking on the next slide as I get used to things. We'll see what happens. I'm just having a bit of trouble with clicking on the next slide, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about tonight. This webinar is based on a core module that we offer all the GP supervisors for registrars in the EV GP training catchment, and we've obviously adapted it tonight to suit the webinar format. But it's really just to cover why stress is an important topic for all of us as educators, a little bit about how to identify that in registrars and some tools and techniques to help you with that work. Again, I'm clicking on the next slide. Glenn, if it doesn't go soon, you can do it for me. I don't know why it's not clicking for me. There we go. So I guess stress is important for all of us if we're going to do our jobs well, both as GPs but as teachers. We do need to think about the stress we experience, and certainly in 2013 there was a very important survey released by Beyond Blue, the National Mental Health Survey of Doctors and Medical Students. And this was a survey that was sent out to almost 43,000 doctors and about almost 7,000 medical students, and they got a 27% response rate, which is actually quite good for this kind of survey. And what the survey showed us was that the level of psychological distress, which was assessed using the K10, was certainly a lot higher than the Australian population, but in particular a lot higher than other Australian professionals. I'm just going to show you a slide with some of the data. And this one is particularly important because while it's true that there was more distress in doctors than in other health professionals, the particular discrepancy was in doctors under the age of 30. And you can see that on the slide here, that both male and female doctors had significantly higher distress than the Australian population, but also much higher than other professionals who are a group that you would normally compare their stress levels to. And certainly about 20% of doctors reported as having ever been diagnosed or treated for depression, with 6% reporting a current diagnosis. So I guess this survey, while you never know for sure, who responds to these kind of surveys. Are they the people who are experiencing distress and so therefore are prompted to respond, or is it a true representation of the population of doctors? I think it certainly is striking to note that the stress levels are particularly high in young doctors, which is the cohort that we're talking about tonight. Most of our registrars are in this age group. The other slide I want to move on to is just to highlight that the other thing that this survey really highlighted for me was the high levels of suicidal ideation in doctors. So this graph shows the percentage of doctors who had thought of suicide in the last 12 months and also prior to the last 12 months. And as you can see, the rates are also very high. So in the previous, doctors thinking of taking their life in their lifetime was as many as 1 in 4. So I guess it is an important reminder to us all that this is a common problem for our profession, and I guess that's why we're having the webinar tonight. Moving on to the next slide. These survey results prompted me to look at what evidence we have in our own catchment, and certainly the catchment that EVGP training in partly overlaps with the old VMA, Victorian Metropolitan Alliance catchment. And there was a survey done there which showed that happily the level of distress in the registrars at the VMA was fairly similar to the normal population. So about 10% of registrars were mildly depressed on the DAS, and about 10% were moderately depressed, which I think is fairly similar to the rates in the general population. We move on to the next slide. I think this is a more interesting study. It's also a very small survey that was done in 2013, published in BMC Medical Education. They got a good response rate, a small number of registrars, only about 128, but that was a 90% response rate. And this group of researchers measured things like risk of burnout, and they used resilience measures to measure the registrar's ability to bounce back from stress. What I found interesting about this survey was the correlation between high resilience, so only 10% of registrars scored high on this psychometric instrument that measured resilience, but they also had a much stronger probability of experiencing personal meaning in their job, and this thing called compassion satisfaction. So they were the group who, seemed to get pleasure from the work they were doing and got meaning in patient care. And I think a lot of you will agree that that's the kind of doctors that we want looking after us into the future. Interestingly, also, the registrars who scored very low on the resilience scores also had higher scores in areas like burnout, anxiety, and in particular, intolerance of uncertainty. So I'm going to come back to that a bit later because I think that's an important thing for us to think about when we're teaching registrars. If we move on to the next slide. I'm going to run a little poll now. I want to see if you can answer this for yourself, your current level of stress, but how you felt in the last week. So if you can just click on the poll, it's anonymous. Okay. So it looks like we've got happily not too many people who are in the extremely severe level of distress, but there's a few out there who are experiencing severe distress, and some who are noticing mild to moderate stress. And I think that's I think that would be pretty typical when we run these workshops in-house, face-to-face. They're very similar levels that we all recognise. Stress comes and goes. For some of us, it might be a good time because school holidays are on. For some of us, that might be a more stressful time. Certainly in my practice, it is, with less doctors available and a pretty bad flu season happening. So just stop the poll and close it. Glenn might have to do that for me because my clicker's not clicking. Lovely. And we'll move on to the next slide. So if you wanted an extra measure to kind of help you to work out how stressed you are, or even perhaps do as an exercise with some of your colleagues and indeed with your registrars, you could turn to the global measure of perceived stress. So this is a psychometric instrument that was developed by Sheldon and Cohen, and it's probably the most widely used psychological instrument for measuring perceived stress. And I think it is an important measure because certainly, first of all, it was developed and validated on a population similar to our registrars, college students, but it's been used many times. And certainly the good thing about this measure is that it does correlate with a lot of important things. So for example, people who score high on this, who have high levels of stress, are also in the group of people who have trouble quitting smoking. High levels of perceived stress is associated with difficulty for people with diabetes in controlling blood sugar levels, and so on. There's even a study that shows that people with a higher perceived level of stress are more susceptible to colds. So anyway, it's just, for me, it's an interesting tool because it's something you might consider using with your registrar, just to start the conversation about how stressed someone's feeling. It's a very difficult conversation to have, and if you've got a tool that you complete and other people in your practice complete and your registrar completes, you might get people talking. And on the next slide, I think Glenn's going to provide a link to this tool. If you wanted to download the tool, you certainly could, and print off a copy and use it in your teaching. Another tool that you can use when you're trying to engage registrars in a discussion of managing stress is to complete a stress inventory. So if we were doing a face-to-face workshop tonight, I would encourage you to sit down and make a list of stressors in your life. And I think a good way to start is to make a list of all the things that you find stressful in your life, so that you can get them out on the table and ideally with your registrar as well have a conversation about them. If we move on to the next slide. This is an example of common stressors that I'm sure we will all recognise in our own lives. The reason this slide is useful to think about is whenever I've done these workshops, time and time again, most people in the room are very good at listing the external stressors in their life. Most people can quite easily identify all these things that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the slide there. I think it's much less common for people to talk about their internal factors that contribute to stress. So we're very good at detecting these in other people, but not so much in ourselves. And I certainly see that in my conversation with supervisors and registrars about difficulties. Registrars are certainly very good at highlighting the external stressors in their life. Um, they find it much harder to talk about some of the internal stressors. Yet their supervisors will often ring up and say, oh, this registrar is struggling because they're very rigid in their thinking, or they're very pessimistic, or they're very anxious. And I think it's an important conversation to have to try and make sure that both of these sides of the list are on the table, because otherwise you would often be talking at cross purposes. So what does the literature say about stress? Well, this next slide I've looked back over the last 20 years of literature about, what things GPs and what things registrars say are stressful, and the main point of this slide is to remind you all that the things that trigger stress in you as more experienced GPs will often be quite different from the things that stress registrars. The real challenge with a list like this is there's a lot of things there that we might often feel we can't do a lot about. And I think that's a challenge for managing your own stress. All these things that we know, like time pressures, fear of litigation, they're all things that we all know are part of our working life. It's certainly important to think that the kind of stressors that the registrars we support might be facing are different to ours, and be careful not to make assumptions about them, but also recognise that we can't automatically help with all of them, but sometimes just acknowledging that they're there and helping registrars to prioritise them can be a big step forward. So moving on to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about this issue of uncertainty, because I think this is something that really is a very big delineator between a very experienced GP and one who's just starting out, particularly because of that Cook study that I referred to earlier that showed that registrars who struggled with uncertainty, who didn't tolerate it well, or who felt very anxious in situations of uncertainty, were also the registrars who had lower resilience scores and higher risk of burnout. So it's just a reminder that we really need to tackle this head on, and I'm well aware there are other GP supervisor webinars run by GPSA that talk about how to support registrars in dealing with uncertainty. And this isn't just to make our lives easier, it's really very much to help registrars to protect them from burnout and from psychological distress. Moving on to the next slide. I put this little slide here just as a reminder for all of us that stress is influenced by many factors, including the context that you're in and your personality and your previous experiences. And I think this is quite important for supervisors to think about when they're looking at registrars. It often surprises me when I'm talking to registrars who come for extra support how many difficult things have gone before them, that they've come to general practice and they've had bad experiences in the hospital. Often that's one of the reasons why they've chosen general practice, but it's also contributed to the way they deal with general practice and what their expectations are. So we might know the example of people who sort of fled the hospital system hoping that general practice would be an easier lifestyle, more lifestyle friendly. And I guess the reality is that in some ways general practice is perhaps more lifestyle friendly. They might have less night call than they had, night duty than they had in the hospital. But in other ways, it's much more stressful because of the breadth of practice, the fact that the buck stops with you when you're in practice, and certainly it's not a 9-to-5 job, even though some registrars come into it with unrealistic expectations. So the message here for supervisors, it's really, really important to get to know your registrars and to spend a little bit of time talking to them about what they did before they came to you, what they liked about their job, what they didn't like, just to open up the conversation so that they will hopefully reveal any previous traumas. Because dealing with learners when you don't know about their previous experiences is very challenging. Let's have a look at The next slide, I just want to fly through this very, very quickly just to remind everyone that, of course, stress is not always bad. I think it's really important to remind our registrars too that, we feel stressed for a reason in general practice. We often want to make sure that we don't harm our patients. We want to make sure we do the best by them. And we teach registrars lots of strategies, of course, to manage stress, but to recognise that stress is there every morning to remind you that you have to do a good job, that sometimes the stakes are quite high. Moving on to the next slide, and thank you, Francis. I see a comment there that a setback is always an opportunity to learn, and I absolutely agree with that. In fact, I think it's really helpful as a supervisor when a registrar does make a mistake to really help them move on and say that, there's no real mistakes unless you don't learn from them. A mistake is an opportunity to learn. Of course, this slide reminds us that sometimes the stress can be bad for us. So this is kind of takes you back perhaps to your medical student days about the biology of stress and the stress response, related to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the real problem of chronic stress and the impact that it has on bodily function. So I won't dwell on this except to say that while stress is not necessarily a bad thing, chronic stress can be very counterproductive, as we all know, and we see quite regularly in many of our patients. And then the next slide, I just want to move on to talk about the ugly stress. I call it the ugly stress. This is the stress that makes us ill. And in the case of registrars, this is the stress that makes a registrar want to give up. And I always find that very, very sad in the job when we meet registrars who are struggling so much that they think of leaving the profession. They've often been on such a long journey to get to where they are, to get to a point where they're thinking of giving up. To me, is something I'd like us all to be able to help prevent. And I think it's challenging for all of us. And I guess I want to move on now in the presentation to start thinking about what some of the red flags are for registrars who might be heading towards this sort of difficult stress. So talking of the red flags, let's do a poll. Can all of you participating rate your level of confidence in detecting stress in your registrar? How good are you at knowing? It's good to see everyone's being fairly honest, so everyone's got some confidence, but there's still quite a large group, at least 10% looking like that, who aren't so confident. So feel free, those of you who are very confident, to put up some suggestions about how you can tell if your registrar is stressed, but we can close the poll to see, for those of you who are not confident or have got some confidence, we'll make sure we give a few ideas. So on to the next slide. So rather than putting up a slide right away, I'd like you all to think about the red flags that you use to notice stress in your registrar. And I guess I'd like you to think about how proactive you are. When you have a new registrar who comes into your practice and you do orientation, thinking about whether you set any time aside during that orientation to actually discuss what the registrar thinks would be a warning of being stressed. People are putting in some red flags here into the chat box. The registrar being less engaged, that's a good one. The person who hides in the tea room, or the person who doesn't want to talk. Registrar who misses meetings, these are all very good red flags. That's interesting. Ruth put the comment in asking questions that they know the answer to. I certainly think that can be a sign of a registrar not being very confident and not being able to deal with uncertainty. Let's move on to the next slide, which gives a summary of some of these things that are coming up. Okay. So I always say jokingly, this is what the internet says are signs and symptoms of stress. But these are certainly well recognised in the population in general. But I think when you look at them, mostly the things that GPs come up with when they're thinking about their registrars or thinking about detecting stress in their colleagues, most of those lists will be behavioural ones. So they'll notice that the registrar isn't engaged, that they're not running on time, that they're not confident with things, that they're asking for help more. So they're often very much behavioural things. I think it's much harder to detect the cognitive signs of stress unless you've got a really good relationship with your registrar. You certainly might notice the emotional side, the registrar who's moody or agitated. I certainly think that's a very reliable indicator of stress for me. When I get angry and agitated, it's usually a very clear sign that I'm feeling stressed. But I guess it's a reminder to all of us that it won't come hit you in the face, obviously, if you just rely on behavioural measures for your registrar. If you just look at how they're behaving, you might miss some of these things. You might need to have a conversation with them. Even the physical ones, even though this is obviously the somatic complaints that we would recognise well in our patients, interestingly, they often come up a lot for registrars as well. We certainly know that registrars, when they start out in practice, do experience a lot more illness, especially if they haven't worked in a paediatric setting, for example. They often get a lot of respiratory infections and gastro and those kind of things. Making sure you make time for registrars and making sure that you don't give them a hard time if they need sick leave, but be supportive early on is very important. And I think probably true as doctors, we don't tend to support our colleagues very well when they're sick, because of course when someone else is sick it means a whole lot more stress and work for us. But certainly in the last 6 months, in my role as registrar support, I would say I've had at least 3 or 4 registrars who have contacted me because they've had physical health issues related to starting work in general practice, and they found it really difficult to take the time off that they need. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. This is one of my favourite pictures. A friend of mine who's not a doctor posted for me to enjoy on Facebook a couple of years ago, and I love it. I actually really enjoy it when patients come in and say they've looked things up on the internet, because to me that's a sign that they're engaged. But there's absolutely no doubt that the demands of patients and the expectations patients have of us can certainly be quite stressful. And having a conversation about that with registrars that enables them to cognitively flip that, to actually see that as a good thing, that it means your patients are health literate and interesting, is probably more important than demonising patients or criticising patients for being interested in their healthcare. So again, this comes back to not just focusing on the behavioural things, but focusing on the cognitive aspects of how we think about stress. And then the next slide, I think we should move on to what to do about stress. So again, if we were in a face-to-face workshop, I'd be asking you all to get out your pens and make 2 headings, self and practice. So under the self heading, thinking of all the things that you do to help you to manage stress, and then another column of all the things that you arrange in your practice to help you manage stress. And again, I put this out here as another really simple activity that you can do with registrars to try and help them to manage stress. So let's move on to the next slide. So we've been running these workshops for a few years now, and here's a pretty typical list that we come up with when we run this with supervisors in Eastern Victoria. I love looking at these lists because I think it's always delightful that the most common way doctors deal with stress from a practice point of view is to not go to work. Fair enough, you do need to take holidays and days off, but of course you also need strategies that make work easier while you're actually there. I guess the other big point to make from this list, and these lists get repeated every time we do these workshops, is you'll notice again most of these interventions for stress are mostly behavioural, so things that doctors do to make things easier for them. So exercise, of course, is good, meditation, taking care about what you eat, not drinking too much alcohol, all those things are very important. But I guess it just reminds us that we're not quite as good at thinking about the way we think about problems. Although you can see down there a few people do talk about debriefing with colleagues or positive thinking. These are kind of getting into the slightly more cognitive realm of how we can deal with stress. So again, I put this out here as an example of something that you could easily do with your registrars or with your colleagues at work to try and create a culture of recognising and honouring the things that we all do and need to do to manage stress. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're starting now to talk about stress management and the cognitive aspects of that, which really leads to this discussion of resilience. And I really have two minds about this conversation. I've read some very good articles written by young doctors recently in the MJA, and some blogs about resilience, and younger doctors decrying the fact that in fact the system is broken, particularly that there's challenges of working in the hospital setting, and it's not fair to put pressure on doctors to just build up resilience. We need to actually work on the system. And I would argue that of course both are important. There is no doubt that people who score strongly on resilience measures, who are able to bounce back from stress, are the ones who enjoy their job more and who get personal meaning from care, and we certainly saw that in the survey that Cook published earlier on. And we also know that if your resilience is low, then you will find work more difficult, that you will find the uncertainty of general practice difficult, and you'll feel more anxious. So we need to really, we can't just say that the system needs to be fixed. We have to acknowledge that part of the work we do as GPs is challenging, and we need to take the responsibility of for ourselves and for our registrars of being able to cope with some of those stressors, because some of them will be unavoidable. So let's move on to the next slide. This is a really nice study that was published in Canadian Family Physician quite a few years ago, but I really like it because it came from the doctors themselves. They actually did a qualitative study of family doctors in Canada, where they asked GPs to nominate family doctors that they thought were really good role models of resilience, doctors that they thought were the kind of doctor that they would like to be or that they aspired to. And then they went and interviewed these doctors. There were 17 of them in total, and talked to them about, why they were so successful and happy and well-rounded in their job. And they came up with these 4 themes that are on this slide. So certainly one of the things was the cognitive aspects, so their attitudes and perspectives, that they were very self-aware, that they valued their role, that they were very perspectives, that they were very self-aware, that they valued their role, that they were very also aware of their limitations, so they didn't have a God complex. They were able to kind of maintain their interest constantly in their profession. The second big theme in this successful, resilient group of doctors was their ability to balance things and to prioritise. And again, I think it's so important that supervisors role model this for registrars. And I'm glad to see people making comments in the chat room about these kind of things, making sure you have time to catch up during the day, making sure that there's a lunch break. Think about little things as well when you're negotiating with the registrar. For example, do you set aside some dedicated admin time for the registrar, or do you just try and slot it in when they've got a catch-up appointment? So again, how you role model that, but also how you encourage registrars to balance and prioritise things. The other thing that these doctors were very good at was practice management. So all these resilient doctors on interview had very clear strategies to make sure their practice ran well. They made sure they surrounded themselves with good and supportive staff, that their practice setup was good. I guess the message here is if your practice is in chaos, it's likely that your ability to manage stress will also be difficult and chaotic. And then of course the 4th thing that these resilient doctors all described were very strong supportive relationships. And again, I think it's important for us to remember as supervisors, we're often at a different stage in life than some registrars, particularly in terms of the kind of relationships we have to support us. I remember as a registrar always marvelling at the supervisors who taught me and how supportive their families were. For example, when they were on call, providing a meal, doing extra things for them. And I don't think that's always the norm for our registrars today. They don't always get that kind of support from family members that we might take for granted. And if you want more resources to think about resilience, this is a really good book that you could certainly order and have as a copy on your shelf. It's called First Do No Harm, which is written by Leanne Rowe and Michael Kidd. And they have a really lovely chapters that outline some of these techniques to build resilience. And I think these they're very similar to the findings that came from that Canadian Family Physician study I was talking about before. So think about some of the things that you can role model from a list like this, particularly making sure that your practice has a proactive way of managing bullying, and I'm sure GPSA has some excellent resources to help you with that. And again, I like the suggestions at the bottom of this list about making our medical organisations work for us and creating a legacy. I think there's no good complaining about the way the world is if we're not prepared to step up and try and make it a better place. And your registrar, a very simple a very simple thing to do would be to buy a copy of this book and encourage registrars to read it, and maybe set aside one of your teaching sessions to talk about self-care and some of the things that you do or that you've seen other doctors do to build up resilience. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So this is another way of thinking about this issue of resilience, and I like to call it values-based teaching. So when you teach your registrars, it's not just about conveying knowledge about the clinical aspects of general practice, or even about the business side of general practice. It's also thinking about the values that you convey. And I particularly like this article really highlights the good and the bad side of the same emotion. So for example, do you see your role as a GP as one of service to help people in need, or do you see that service as leading to you feeling constantly deprived? Do you strive for excellence, or do you consider yourself invincible? Do you recognize that you have a competence to cure people, imperfect as it is, or do you consider yourself omnipotent? And finally, how can you show, how much do you show compassion versus how easy it is in our profession to become quite isolated and lost because of all the suffering and the difficulties that we see. And I think you sometimes see these behaviours in registrars when they come from the hospital setting. I certainly have encountered registrars who have lost their ability to feel compassion. They're often, very cynical about their training, and I think that's, one of the things that it's great to see when a registrar like that meets a very caring supervisor. I mean, that enables them to really be the Yoda in the balance of this, to keep on the light side and not go to the dark side. And I hope that you'll all consider about having a conversation about the values that you. Someone's put an interesting comment there about young registrars who have spouses that don't understand the job. Someone's put an interesting comment there about young registrars who have spouses that don't understand the job. I think that is an important point. I certainly used to make the joke that when I was a kid, the GP was really a two-person job. There was, certainly my family GP was who brought me into the world as well. He was a lovely GP, but really he also had a partner at home who completely ran the household. And I think we all have to acknowledge that that's a much less common scenario today. It's a wonderful thing because it's led to the feminisation of the workforce, but it does mean that some of our young registrars don't necessarily have that support or understanding that some of us might have grown up with in our professional lives. So it's important to think about the environment the registrar comes from. So let's move on and finish up really perhaps with something a little bit more practical. So these are just some stress management tools that I think for those of you who are just starting out in this area and want to have some suggestions, these might give you some resources. Okay, so the next slide. Here are some stress management tools that I think all practices should have at their fingertips. These are some really good examples of things that you can easily download from the Black Dog Institute website, from their psychological toolkit. The first one is a list of relaxation techniques, and I use this with patients but also with registrars to say, there's not one size fits all in terms of working out what kind of relaxation you should do. Rather than saying to a registrar, I do mindfulness and you should do the same because it works brilliantly for me, you could offer them some of these tools to try and encourage them to try things out for themselves. And similarly, the fact sheet on the right there, which can be downloaded and printed and put on the staff notice board with just some very practical examples of how to deal with stress. And again, just to role model it and do something in the practice to acknowledge that. This next slide is to remind you of the fact that there are now some excellent e-mental health resources available. I've chosen this one, My Compass, as an example because I think it's particularly designed for people who are experiencing sort of mild to moderate depression and anxiety symptoms. So you don't have to, it's very much normalizes the idea of help seeking. And in particular, it's very good because it's modular. So instead of having to start at the beginning and work your way consecutively through all the modules, you can just pick up at any point in time and pick a module and that'll certainly give you more authenticity if you're recommending it to a registrar to try out. Even if you just use this as an example of something you could, and that'll certainly give you more authenticity if you're recommending it to a registrar to try out. Even if you just use this as an example of something you could encourage your registrar to use with patients. But I do think for those of us who do a lot of psychological strategies will all agree that doing them yourself is also a good learning experience personally, as well as a tool that you can share with others. Let's move on now to professional help. So certainly in our organisation, we have good access to psychological support for our registrars. It's free and it's de-identified, it's confidential, and I'm sure your RTO would have something similar. So it's important that you ask for that, about that. I'm just reading the chat marks there. Relaxation exercises an escape from a job they're unhappy with. I certainly agree with that comment, James. A relaxation strategy on its own, if you haven't dealt with the cognitions or the thoughts behind your job and your expectation of the job, is not enough on its own. It's a very good point that you do need to think about your thoughts and why you're doing the job, as well as doing some relaxation techniques. They're not separate. So Glenn's moving us on to the poll. I'm interested to see whether you have your own family doctor. Okay. Well, it's wonderful to see that more and more people now, the vast majority of you at least have a family doctor, and nobody thinks it's unnecessary. I certainly think if we'd done this poll 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been the way it is there. So I'm really pleased to see that people are engaged in their own doctor, having their own doctor, and I certainly think it's an absolute no-brainer that you should be encouraging your registrar to have their own doctor, and in particular make sure it's not someone in your own practice. Ideally it should be someone outside that you've chosen independently, and registrars should do the same. I think we can close that poll now, but well done for those of you who recognise the benefit of it. Here's a resource for those of you who maybe don't have a doctor yet or aren't so sure about it, the Australasian Doctors Health Network. So this is a good place to start because it provides links to the doctors advisory services in all states. It also has some good resources for how you can help others, and links to other kind of services, and in particular it's got different resources for different types of doctors, and it can help people find a doctor. So even though most of you will probably never need to use this website because you'll have your own family doctor and you'll go to your own GP for help, it's important that you're aware of these services, particularly if you encounter a registrar who's really struggling. It's nice to see some of those comments there about people saying not everybody has a job they're happy with. I think that's absolutely true. And also the great news is that sometimes a job can be happy for a period of time, but then become less enjoyable and then get good again. And I think that's the nature of a job. If you're going to stick in general practice for your lifetime, it's important to remember it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I think that's a really important thing to remind registrars of as well, mainly because our registrars are often very focused on the short term. You know, they're in a training program for a very short period of time. The program's certainly less flexible than it was a decade ago, and they're very focused on their exams and getting their fellowship. And that's all well and good in the short term, but I think our role as supervisors and educators is to also give them the strategies to help them cope with their career over a long period of time. So I just want to finish up with this slide. It probably won't surprise any of you who are listening that I have a strong interest in psychological medicine, but particularly in cognitive therapy. I'm not going to do a CBT training session tonight, but I guess for those of you who don't yet use cognitive therapy in your practice, I would really encourage you to think about cognitive therapy approaches you could use in your teaching as well, which is really about understanding how we think and how that affects our emotional responses. And that's why I love this quote from Shakespeare, that there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Particularly helping registrars with this notion of uncertainty. So you can do the cognitive bit, which is recognizing that I feel uncomfortable because I'm uncertain. But then the next step is to get the registrar to do a behavioural strategy that helps them feel more comfortable. So as an example, asking a registrar to practice saying to a patient, I'm not sure what's going on here, but this is what we're going to do to sort it out. This is something we become very comfortable with as experienced GPs, but when you're starting out, being able to just verbalise to a patient about the uncertainty that you're feeling creates a lot of anxiety. So that's where you can link a cognition, which is I must be a competent doctor and show that I know what I'm doing, with a stressful reaction versus a doctor who says, well, of course, being competent, I should feel comfortable in being able to say that I'm uncertain, and to practice saying that appropriately. And we can certainly role model that. Another suggestion I would have, if you find this more difficult to do, is to make sure that you spend time directly observing your registrar, and also allowing them to spend time directly observing you, so that they get used to how you as an experienced clinician express uncertainty, and then they can rehearse it with support from you. Okay, I think that's probably enough on CBT, but I would encourage those of you who are interested in pursuing it more to look up some more CBT resources. In particular, as a starting point, you might like to tune into this YouTube video, which is a lovely TED talk by Kelly McGonigal, who's actually a health psychologist who confesses in this TED talk that she spent most of her career encouraging people to avoid stress, when in fact the research clearly shows that experiencing stress isn't harmful unless you believe it to be harmful. So she gives a lot of good examples of this from research that's been done on, the body's response to stress, cardiovascular disease, etc., etc. And if you're not convinced about the power of thinking from my talk, you certainly might be encouraged to think about it when you listen to Kelly's talk. And she goes on to talk about some lovely other ways of dealing with stress, and touches on the issue of oxytocin, which is a stress hormone that actually pushes us to seek social interaction. So it's a very interesting talk if you want to further that. Okay, I won't dwell on that talk anymore, except to say think about the cognitive aspects. And this little framework is a slide that might help you to think about it a little bit more. So this builds on the kind of Yoda Darth Vader scenario I created before, where you can actually use some specific sort of cognitive strategies to help a registrar prevent things like compassion fatigue or emotional exhaustion. It gives some examples. So for example, this ability to reframe the work we do, to be appreciative of the opportunities we have and grateful for the chance we have to help our patients. Certainly for people who are feeling emotionally exhausted, thinking about mindfulness techniques, some self-compassion, those kind of things. And certainly thinking about how well we listen to our registrars and how much we create a space for them to talk about what worries them most. Okay. So maybe you can use that framework to think about some strategies you can do in direct conversation with your registrar. I think that's probably getting near the end of the presentation now. If we just move on to the next slide. This is a little talk for you to, a little quote from the Dalai Lama for you to maybe think about, maybe to help you motivate you to encourage your registrar and your colleagues to look after each other. And that leaves us a little bit of time if people have any questions or any other comments. I see there's been a comment there about the stress of exam failure. I certainly think it is very important to recognise that these exams are very high stake. I'm often surprised how supervisors don't proactively offer registrars a little bit of time to prepare. And when I say time to prepare, I don't think registrars should be given days off from work in preparing. I think they should be encouraged to have extra support from their supervisors. For example, if you have a registrar who's struggling with the KFP, to think about offering them some random case analysis and giving them strategies that can build up their confidence as they prepare for these more difficult assessments. Okay. Well, I think that's probably all I wanted to say. It
Fantastic.
certainly is more difficult on a
Radio.
webinar. It's not as interactive as it would be if we were all in
No,
the
you
room
don't have,
together.
certainly don't have
But
the
I
same
hope in
interaction
summary
as you would have
you
within
have a little bit of
an audience.
an idea now about how to start the conversation with your registrars about stress and the kinds of stresses they might experience. And hopefully you also have a little bit of some frameworks that can help you.
That's fantastic, Carolyn. Apologies for talking over you there. There is a little bit of a lag online tonight, so that wasn't on purpose at all. Thanks very much for your session tonight. Please do, for those of you that have joined us and have been listening intently to Carolyn and haven't had a chance to have a look at the documents folder, there's fantastic links and resources in there. There is the identifying and supporting registrars at risk in there. Carolyn, you also mentioned bullying and harassment. We do have a guide to support practices with that as well. There is plenty more that could be said about this topic, I'm absolutely certain, Carolyn. So thanks very much for giving us your time, and thanks also to EVGPT for making this webinar possible as well. We really appreciate you making time tonight to make this happen. Of course, if you've enjoyed this webinar, we'd really love your feedback. We will have sent out a evaluation form for tonight's webinar. We'd love you to provide that feedback so that we can only continue to improve these sessions. And obviously, thank you all for giving up an hour of your time tonight. Please do have a look out for our next webinar. We will make sure that you know about it, but we should have another interesting title coming up very, very shortly. So thanks very much for giving us your time, and we'd also like to acknowledge the funding that GPSA received from the Australian Government under the AGPT program. Always very important. Thank you all. Thank you, Caroline. I'll talk to you in just a moment.